Hidden behind banks of rolling fog on a lonely moor, an ancient tower stretches toward a perpetually overcast sky. Its walls of crumbling stone and mortar have stood for centuries against winds that whistle mournful laments, as though the souls of the lost are forever trapped behind the cold basalt walls. Night and day blur together in the gloom, lending the structure an unsettling stillness. Yet this place is not abandoned, for a solitary figure resides within, an aging caretaker who moves quietly through the echoing halls. The caretaker has no living family and goes by no name, at least none so frequently spoken that it matters. Work here is neither for glory nor comfort, but to endure a role passed down for untold generations. It is said that once, long ago, the caretaker's ancestors discovered the tower's secret. Each window, shattered or intact, is a window not onto the moor outside, but onto a tragedy long past. Centuries slip away when one peers through those frames, revealing flickers of demise and despair from times best left forgotten. Legend claims no one returns unchanged after glimpsing the horrors beyond the glass. Yet duty binds the caretaker to remain, maintaining the tower's solemn hush and mending the windows so that what lurks in each memory does not break free. Each floor of the tower holds its own peculiarities. The ground level is a clutter of corded mops, buckets, and tall shelves sagging under the weight of ancient ledgers. Flickering lanterns cast dim light across the floor's uneven flagstones, the caretaker's boots echoing as they traverse the chamber. Once a day, they do a thorough cleaning, ensuring that the creeping mud from outside does not stain the patterned floors any more than the passing centuries have done. There are doors that lead nowhere, and corridors that loop back on themselves, as if the tower is testing or teasing whoever dares walk its halls. But most peculiar of all are the windows. There are 15 in total, shaped in various sizes, scattered unpredictably along the interior. From the outside, any visitor would notice none at all, only the tower's uniform exterior stretching upward. That contradiction is among the tower's many inscrutable mysteries. There should be fewer windows than walls, yet the caretaker's daily route confirms their existence. Some windows appear as tall arches, others round portholes. Thick webs cling to their frames until the caretaker comes with a rag and a whisper of caution. To clean the windows is the caretaker's chief responsibility. Though each cleaning is done swiftly, eyes averted as much as possible. Yet sooner or later the caretaker must check the glass for cracks, forcing a brief glance into the horrors that lull behind each portal. On the caretaker's first rounds after taking over the position, they avoided looking through the windows for several days. But rust gathers, glass breaks, and the caretaker knew that ignoring them was no solution. So one morning, bracing themselves, the caretaker moved from the first window to the next, determined to fulfill the official duty, to maintain the tower and contain whatever is sealed behind its windows. Standing at the first, the keeper wiped centuries of dust, then dared a glance. Immediately the glass flared with unnerving brightness. Through it, an intimate scene unfolded in some medieval courtyard. Throngs of townspeople gathered around a small scaffold. A wooden block sat at the center. A figure wearing threadbare rags knelt, hands bound behind their back. A headsman raised a gleaming axe. Within the caretaker's vantage, time seemed to slow, each face carved in panic or sadistic glee. Then steel descended. The caretaker jerked back in horror, breath catching as an afterimage of blood stained the mind's eye. Beads of sweat formed beneath the caretaker's collar despite the chilly tower air. Resolute, they forced themselves to turn away. The caretaker dreaded climbing the stairs to the next floor, yet felt compelled to continue. Tools must be used, duties carried out. Each footstep on the cracked steps sent dislodged bits of stone clattering downward, echoes threatening to conjure ghosts from the deep. The caretaker couldn't help but wonder whether the tower itself was alive, aware of every footfall and heartbeat, feeding on their fear. Nonetheless, the caretaker pressed on, up the curving staircase to the second window. This second window was half obscured by cobwebs so thick they might have formed a veil. Carefully, the caretaker brushed them aside. Checking the glass for damage, they paused, unavoidable curiosity prompting another glimpse. This time, the window framed a 17th century battlefield. Men in muddied armor clashed on a field of trampled grass. Smoke rose from tattered banners. Horses screamed as they stumbled over bodies, and rain drizzled in unyielding gloom. The caretaker felt as though they were standing on that same field, hearing the clang of steel and anguished cries. Lightning flashed across the sky. The caretaker recoiled as a cannon roared, sending shrapnel everywhere. The scene vanished as soon as the caretaker pulled back, heart hammering in their chest. Shaken, they swore never to linger at any window longer than necessary. The daily chores continued, but the caretaker found it ever more difficult to ignore the call of the windows. Curiosity battled with dread. Over the weeks, they encountered glimpses of a plague-ridden village, rotting corpses carted away on rattling wagons. They saw the great fire of a distant, sprawling city, flames devouring rooftops while silhouettes screamed to the unhearing sky. In another flicker of centuries gone by, a courtroom condemnation. A woman burned at the stake under the shrill accusations of witchcraft. Each tragedy played out as though the caretaker were truly present, the atmosphere thick with despair that clung to them like a cold sweat. The caretaker's nights became sleepless. Whenever they closed their eyes, images of the tower's phantasmal windows blinked behind drooping lids. And in these nightmares, each tragedy melded together into one endless panorama of horror. They saw a drunken king ordering the execution of a traitor, a father raging at a child for a sin unknown, a trembling group of peasants waiting for unstoppable doom. At times, the caretaker sensed that the figures in these windows were aware of being watched. On more than one occasion, an accusing gaze or a beckoning hand seemed to press against the glass from the other side. Whenever dawn arrived, the caretaker resolved to keep the windows free to stave off the tower's creeping sense of corruption. But the tension was unrelenting some nights. The caretaker believed they could hear faint voices calling from the stone walls, begging for release. Muffled screams or chanting from an era of magic, harsh war cries or whispered pleas made the caretaker's blood run cold. On the third level, an especially tall, pointed window awaited, with an iron grate that had rusted in place. The caretaker jimmied it loose, letting it fall with a clang that echoed through the tower's deserted corridors. Scrubbing the edge of the glass, they tried to avoid a direct look, but the dancing shades of color compelled a glance. A new vision. A 19th century asylum with locked doors along either side of a corridor. The moans of the inmates wreathed the caretaker's mind in horror. A figure in a soiled, tattered gown shuffled down the corridor, arms extended, eyes wide with mania or fear. Nurses or wardens wearing severe expressions stood by with instruments of restraint. The caretaker trembled, cold dread settling into their chest as the scene blacked out once more. Once the grate was rehung, the caretaker rushed off, heart pounding. Sometimes, in the lonely hours of the night, the caretaker thought to stake the windows shut forever, but deep down they knew that the tower's entire existence hovered on preserving these windows as they were. Some force greater than reason or fear seemed to govern them, cracking them, covering them, or ignoring them, could release an unknown cataclysm. Each caretaker in the ancestral line had left cryptic notes in the ledgers. "Do not block the windows," read one, "lest the tower's sorrow bleed outside." The caretaker determined not to open a door to an evil that might cross centuries unchecked. As the years wore on, the caretaker's hair whitened. The lines across their face deepened, a road map of anxieties. An occasional melody of wind howling between cracks in the mortar seemed almost comforting compared to the hush that otherwise cloaked the tower. Still, the caretaker performed daily tasks like a ritual, wiping the floors, reinforcing the old stone steps, dusting the labyrinthine shelves. Then came the weekly window inspections, carefully climbing level by level, checking the frames for any sign of fracture. With each inspection, an old tragedy renewed itself, making the caretaker question how many more times they could endure the terror. Yet the caretaker's sense of duty never faltered. The caretaker developed a grim acceptance of these visions. They began to wonder if these fleeting glimpses of sorrow might serve as cautionary tales, crumpled testaments from history that must not be repeated. Perhaps the tower existed as its own kind of library, archiving the worst fates that mortals inflicted on themselves. During those solitary hours spent polishing stone busts or cataloging old accounts, the caretaker remembered more than just the horror of the images. They also recalled the heartbreak and regret emanating from the tragedies displayed. A deep empathy began to shape itself within the caretaker's soul. It was on a placid autumn evening, as the caretaker stood by a battered wooden table sipping watered-down wine, that a peculiar occurrence happened. Usually each window displayed only the air it belonged to, but that night, one of the lower windows revealed something else. A single watery light flickered beyond the glass, illuminating a shape the caretaker could not quite discern. Intrigued, the caretaker set down the mug and approached with silent steps. The window was partially fogged over, and the caretaker gently wiped the condensation away. Rather than the inevitable scene of some dark historical tragedy, there was an echoing interior that resembled the tower's own hallway. It looked as though the caretaker were gazing into the corridor behind them, but from a slightly different angle. In that reflection, a figure stood in the caretaker's place. At first, it appeared to be the caretaker themselves, but the figure's posture was too stiff, the eyes too severe. The caretaker's heart accelerated. Slowly, the figure in the reflection raised a hand in greeting. Or was it a warning? Its lips moved silently. Ice trickled through the caretaker's veins. Although no sound came through, the caretaker felt certain the figure was mouthing, "Turn back." Then in a heartbeat, the reflection rippled like a mere puddle disturbed by a stone, and the caretaker stood face to face with a new scene. Beyond the reformed vision lay a roaring crowd. Tall pillars framed a dais, clad in white marble, somewhere in the classical era. Chains rattled as a prisoner was dragged forth, battered and bleeding. A stern judge in an austere toga delivered a sentence in a language lost to time, and the begs for mercy filled the caretaker's ears. Before the caretaker could absorb more, they recoiled with a haunted gasp. The caretaker blinked rapidly, overwhelmed by a dizziness that forced them into a knee, barely managing to steady themselves against the wall. Once they regained composure, the caretaker found the window dark again. The tower gave no explanation for what had just occurred. The following days, the caretaker felt a persistent sense of being observed. Shadows along the narrow corridors seemed ready to hurl themselves forward, swallowing the caretaker in an embrace of midnight. The caretaker carried a lantern wherever they went, even in daytime, as if darkness might leap out at any moment, bridging the gap between the illusions and the caretaker's world. Eventually, the caretaker found the courage to inspect each window once more, searching for signs of a repeated anomaly. The caretaker longed to see that strange reflection again, to decipher the ghostly figure's message. Floor by floor, the caretaker climbed, shining the lantern in every dusty corner. Yet the windows offered only their usual horrors. One displayed a gallows in a town square, another a ravaged castle sinking in a muddy swamp, and yet another a 20th century battlefield scorched by bombs. The caretaker's chest tightened at each flash of suffering. No reflection reappeared. Fate, however, had not relinquished its grip on the caretaker. One moonless night, while rest did not come easily, the caretaker wandered downstairs, deciding to busy themselves with reorganizing the tower's records, anything to quell the churning worry in their mind. At the base of the tower, among rickety shelves, lay ledgers dating back to the caretaker's earliest known ancestor. Candlelight danced across the leather spines. Flipping open one worn volume, the caretaker found a series of meticulous lines, each describing tragedies glimpsed through windows. An entry from centuries earlier noted the prisoner dragged to the scaffold, identical to the caretaker's own experience. Another described the land scorched by plague, reminiscent of what the caretaker had seen. The caretaker paused at a particularly odd note from a caretaker many generations past, reading how they had once looked through a window to see their own reflection, only to be warned of impending doom. Flipping through more pages, the caretaker discovered references to the tower's heart. It recurred throughout the ledger, with cryptic remarks like, "Should the tower's heart ever crack, the illusions will manifest." Another cryptic note, "All windows reflect the darkest corners of man's cruelty, but they also reflect the caretaker's spirit. One must never let the tower's heart break." A trembling unease racked the caretaker. The notes gave no clear indication of how to find the source or what threatened it. Driven by grim resolve, the caretaker decided to venture higher than ever before. The tower had floors few had accessed in living memory. Dark extremes at the pinnacle where staircases decayed and no caretaker had trod for generations. The caretaker filled a satchel with tools, a lantern, a thick coil of rope, nails, and an iron hammer. With trembling hands, they began their ascent. The higher levels were a labyrinth of broken steps and collapsed beams. Loose stones threatened to plunge into the darkness below. The caretaker lit the lantern, carefully maneuvering around precarious ledges. Drafts of freezing air howled through cracks in the walls, moaning like trapped souls. Eventually, the caretaker's eyes made out a door of heavy oak, banded with iron. Rusted nails jutted out from the wood like teeth. When the caretaker pushed, the door groaned open, revealing a chamber that reeked of dust and time. The caretaker coughed on the stale air and raised the lantern high, its trembling light revealing a small room dominated by an immense mirror leaning against the far wall. The caretaker paused, heart thrumming, presumably recognizing that this might be the fabled tower's heart. Time had worn the edges of the mirror's frame, which was etched with swirling designs and symbols reminiscent of arcane alphabets. A thick layer of grime coated the glass, the caretaker's reflection only faintly discernible. Gathering courage, the caretaker withdrew a rag from the satchel and began to wipe the surface. As the filth cleared, a swirl of motion seemed to pulse inside the mirror, like a shimmering vortex of shadows and pale light. The caretaker gulped, uncertain whether they were imagining things. Once a little over half of the mirror was cleaned, the caretaker's reflection sharpened. At first, it was nothing more than a humble figure in dusty clothes, burdened by age. But the reflection soon changed. The caretaker's face contorted, lines deepening, mouth twisting as if in agony. Then it shifted again, morphing into a younger visage, then an older one still, flickering through countless incarnations of caretaker past, caretaker future. Visions of these caretakers performing their tasks in the tower played across the mirror's surface like apparitions in a dream. Some had collapsed in despair by the tower's windows. Others had triumphantly stood guard, arms folded. A swirl of voices whispered in languages that spanned centuries, overlapping into a susurrus that made the caretaker grimace in disorientation. A sudden quake rattled the floor. The caretaker grabbed hold of the doorframe, letting the mirror tip forward slightly. The swirling lights inside grew more intense, throbbing with an otherworldly brilliance that threatened to blind. In the reflection, the caretakers saw each tragedy-laden window from the floors below. For an instant, it was as if all those windows now gazed upon the caretaker. A sickening sensation, like being judged by centuries of condemned souls, rolled through the caretaker's stomach. The caretakers squeezed their eyes shut. The quake subsided. When the caretaker finally opened their eyes, the reflection stabilized, revealing an earnestly somber expression staring back. A reflection that no longer matched the caretaker's current features. The caretaker steadied their breath, stepping closer in a voice that echoed without sound, as if within the caretaker's mind, the reflection spoke. "This tower is a sentinel for all tragedies. You have entrusted your life to its care, and in return it demands your presence. Will you endure until the last tragedy is revealed? Tears stung the caretaker's eyes. They had never imagined speaking directly to the tower, nor its speaking back. Resolutely, the caretaker set down the rag, took a trembling breath, and answered in a hushed tone, "I will. If that is my duty, I remain. But I must know, how does one ensure that the horrors do not spill over?" A precarious hush filled the chamber. For a moment the caretaker feared the mirror might not answer at all. Then the reflection changed. An image of the caretaker toiling day after day to clean and mend the windows flashed across the mirror. The caretaker understood. Vigilance was the only key, but the caretaker also sensed an unspoken warning, as if the tower required not only careful curation, but an unwavering acceptance of its burden. Any weakness or attempt to abandon the post risked shattering those windows and releasing centuries of tragedy upon the present. As if to confirm the caretaker's fears, a small crack puckered across the corner of the mirror's glass. It was hair-thin, yet it radiated the potential of unimaginable devastation. With shaking hands, the caretaker reached for the hammer and some leftover mortar powder in the satchel. Unsure whether mortal means could mend a supernatural break, the caretaker gingerly applied the mortar. Steadying the glass, the caretaker hammered a brace of wood along the side of the mirror where the frame was rotten. Each strike of the hammer echoed with finality, line after line of reflection fracturing into a kaleidoscope of centuries. Through every splinter of glass, the caretaker glimpsed a flickering tale of ruin. With each hammer blow, the caretaker's arms felt heavier, as though they carried the weight of civilizations. Finally, the caretaker set the hammer down and slumped, exhausted yet resolute. The caretaker tentatively watched the crack. A faint glow emanated from the mortar, subsiding as if the tower itself recognized the caretaker's resolve to protect the seal. The caretaker exhaled a long breath of relief. With the immediate danger addressed, the caretaker realized the reflection had faded. The mirror revealed only the caretaker's exhausted, age-haggard face, and the caretaker felt oddly alone again. Yet they sensed the tower's quiet approval, as though allowed to remain for now. The journey down from the pinnacle was treacherous, each step a reminder that a single misstep could send them tumbling to their doom. Descending through the labyrinth of broken steps, the caretaker paused at each landing to regain composure. Every undone tragedy from the windows below seemed to pulse, beckoning the caretaker home. When the caretaker reached the lower floors, the windows were silent, their scenes dormant for the moment. The caretaker made a slow circuit, verifying that none of the heavy glass was fractured in a way that could leak into the present. At some windows, the caretaker saw faint silhouettes, but they no longer displayed their tragedies with vivid detail. It was as if the entire tower was momentarily asleep, recouping from its near catastrophe. Bit by bit, the caretaker resumed routine tasks. No more illusions, no urgent glimpses demanded attention that day. The silent, candlelit corridors felt almost peaceful, reminiscent of a beast lulled into momentary rest. The caretaker tended the clutter in the ground level, reorganized the shelves, and replaced burned-out candles with fresh ones. In the hush permeating the tower, the caretaker's thoughts wandered. A faint sense of companionship lingered, imagining the legion of past caretakers who had once done these very chores. For the first time in ages, the caretaker allowed a small smile. As the sun set, painting the horizon beyond the moor a dull reddish hue, the caretaker wandered to a mid-level window, one that typically showed a scene of witch trials. Tonight, it displayed only a haze of swirling shadows, like a veil parted. A hush fell, broken only by the thumping of the caretaker's heart. Tired, but still compelled, the caretaker placed a steadying hand on the windowsill. A fleeting question drifted through the caretaker's mind. Was continuing this vigil the only path? Or did the caretaker dare to attempt a final release? The caretaker closed their eyes, whispering a solemn vow. "I will remain. I will not fail those trapped beyond the glass." The vow seemed to pulse in the caretaker's blood as each recollection, executions, wars, plagues, condemnation passed in slow sequence. So long as someone remained to watch over this tower, perhaps the tragedies confined within would serve as testament rather than unleash evil. The caretaker lingered for a moment, prepared to check for cracks in the frames one final time. Content that all was secure, they extinguished the lantern, letting residual lamplight from the corridor guide them to the caretaker's chamber. The caretaker's room was modest, just a narrow cot, a single chest, and a tiny fireplace whose embers glowed faintly. Settling onto the cot, the caretaker felt the day's exhaustion weigh upon their limbs. Though the tower's burdens were vast, that night a peculiar calmness thawed the caretaker's cold dread. Not a release from the watch, but a small respite. Night enveloped the tower, cradling it in dark clouds. Beyond the tower's walls, the moor whispered under the wind's breath. Within its core stood the caretaker, unwavering. Over the coming days, the caretaker would again attend to each window, witnessing horrors spanning eras. They would again ascend to check the tower's highest room, ensuring no fresh cracks formed in that ancient mirror. Shadows high and low would groan, and distant cries from centuries past would swirl through the tower's labyrinthine hallway. In that precarious stillness, the caretaker realized a profound truth. Every tragedy behind the windows did not truly end. It seethed there, trapped outside of time, and it was the caretaker's duty to keep that boundary strong. The caretaker would not be the last or the first. When their life eventually ended, broken by age and fatigue, another would take their place, drawn by the same inexorable calling. And so the cycle would continue, preserving the tower's silent vigil for centuries to come. But for now, this caretaker had been granted another day. Beneath the tower's looming walls and the swirl of centuries cloaked just beyond the windows, they found a slender thread of hope. Perhaps, in bearing witness to so many tragedies, one might glean how to turn the tide of cruelty. Or perhaps, sorrow was a relentless force, always existing but always contained. Though the caretaker's heart beat with tension, a delicate notion of peace hovered in the air. The caretaker drifted to sleep as moonlight filtered through unseen cracks, illuminated the crest of the tower, where countless watchful souls from the past stood guard over the caretaker's restless dreams. And so, in the sleepless hush of timeless walls, the tower abided, and with it, the solitary sentinel, resolute against the tragedies that might otherwise envelop the present in a tidal wave of centuries-old despair.